My husband was barely cold in the ground when he told me our children were trying to kill me. If you're listening to this on your phone, on the bus, or in your kitchen, take a breath with me for a second. Imagine thinking you'd raised decent human beings and then hearing them calmly discuss your murder like a business expense. And if you want to stay with me through all of this, you might as well settle in now. It gets worse. Much worse. James Henderson died on a Thursday afternoon, alone in his little home office overlooking the back garden. At least, that's what I was told at first. Heart attack. Sudden. Tragic, but unsurprising at his age. I found him slumped in his chair, glasses still perched on his nose, the cursor blinking on a spreadsheet on the laptop, one sock half off, the bed in the next room still neatly made. It looked almost staged, like he'd just paused mid-sentence and forgotten to finish. The paramedics were kind, too kind. They spoke in those softened NHS voices people use for toddlers and the very old, explaining things I already knew. These things happen. One of them said, I remember nodding, feeling nothing but a sort of hollow ache in my chest and a ringing in my ears. Have you ever had that, where the world is suddenly made of cotton wool and everyone else seems to be underwater? David arrived first, roaring up in that ridiculous black BMW of his, music thudding even as he parked outside our quiet suburban semi like he was on some London nightclub run, not at his father's death scene. He swept in with his expensive coat and his solicitor's voice, talking straight to the paramedics, hand on my shoulder as if he'd been there all along. Sarah came half an hour later, in scrubs, smelling faintly of antiseptic and those synthetic floral plug-ins they use on hospital wards. She took one look at James's body and then at me, eyes shining with perfectly controlled tears. You must rest. Mum. She kept saying, her hand cool and professional on my wrist. We'll handle everything. You just take your medication and sleep. By medication, she meant the little white tablets she put into my palm and watched me swallow. Sedatives, she said, something the GP had prescribed just in case. I did what she expected an old, shattered woman to do. I nodded dumbly, put them in my mouth, took a sip of water. I did not swallow. I tucked them into the space between my gum and cheek, the way I used to hide peas as a child, and later spat them into a tissue in the downstairs loo. I told myself I was being dramatic, paranoid. But James had always said, when something feels wrong, Nell, pay attention. The funeral was a blur of damp coats and umbrellas. The sky overcast in that particular English way that makes everything look like an old photograph. St. Michael's Church was full partners from James's accountancy firm, neighbors from up the road, a few of my old colleagues from the primary school. David stood beside me like a bodyguard, one hand firmly on my elbow, the other sliding business cards into people's hands. Sarah moved through the pews with tissues and soft smiles, dabbing at her eyes exactly when people were looking. They played the dutiful children so perfectly that even I almost believed it. Almost. Afterwards, in the crematorium car park, my friend Sheila squeezed my arm and whispered, "You're lucky to have them. Love, they'll look after you now." I remember thinking, with a little flare of guilt, will they? That first night alone in the house was the worst. The silence was wrong, not peaceful, but expectant, like the house was holding its breath. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the empty chair where James ought to have been reading the paper. The landline rang at 1147 p.m. Exactly. I only looked at the clock because nobody ever calls the landline anymore, and certainly not at that hour. Mrs. Henderson. The man's voice was low, careful. "This is Robert Morrison. I was the director at your husband's funeral today. For a moment I thought something had gone wrong with the coffin, that they'd lost him, swapped him. Something absurd. Yes, I said, my throat tight. I'm terribly sorry to disturb you so late, but I've found something you need to see. It couldn't wait till morning. He hesitated, then added, It concerns your husband and your children. You know that feeling when your stomach seems to drop straight through the floor that, be honest with me, would you have gone, at that time of night, to a funeral home because a stranger asked you to? I did. Of course I did. Grief makes you obedient, and curiosity is its own kind of madness. The funeral home was on the edge of town, near the industrial estate, a bland brick building with frosted glass and a car park that smelled faintly of damp tarmac and lilies. Robert was waiting for me inside, tall and thin with a face like a long exclamation mark, hands folded neatly. I'm so sorry again, Mrs. Henderson, he began, leading me through to a small office at the back. There were folders stacked on one wall, a calendar with a generic beach scene, and on the desk, a small plastic evidence-style bag. He pushed it towards me with 2 fingers. Inside was a cheap little digital recorder, the sort you might buy off Amazon for a tenner, and a folded piece of lined paper, yellowed from being inside fabric. We were preparing your husband's suit for cremation, he said. One of the team noticed a seam that had been tampered with. Hand stitching, not the original tailoring. We unpicked it. He nodded at the bag. These were sewn into an inner pocket. For a second, I thought of letters, maybe love notes, something romantic, some secret life I didn't know about. I almost laughed. The idea of James having an affair. Ridiculous. He barely remembered to buy his own socks. Why didn't you just give these to my son? I asked. Robert's gaze flicked to the door, then back to me. Because the first name on that note is your son's, he said quietly, and the second is your daughter's. I thought it best to give them to you directly. I opened the bag with fingers that didn't seem to belong to me. The paper was dense with James's neat accountant handwriting, bullet points, dates, numbers. At the top, underlined twice. David and Sarah, if I die suddenly, read this first. My throat closed up. My eyes snagged on phrases, cash BMW. No finance. Sarah's new house. Impossible on nurse's salary. Phase 1 poisoning. Phase 2 bomb. Bomb. The word sat there on the page like a live thing. Robert cleared his throat. There's also the recording. He said, I haven't listened to it. I thought that should be your decision. Do you have batteries? I asked. My voice sounded strange, flatter, older. He fetched some from a drawer, slid them across without a word. I loaded the recorder, my hands shaking just enough to make the plastic click too loudly. The room smelled of disinfectant and something sweet and cloying. Lilies again. Always lilies. I pressed play. The first voice was James's. Calm, precise. The way he sounded when he explained tax codes to me over dinner. If you're hearing this, Nell, he said, and I nearly dropped the device. I'm gone, and it wasn't natural. You need to listen to everything. Then call Detective Ray Martinez at Thames Valley Police. I've given him copies, but he'll need you alive. Alive, as if that were in question. There was a rustle, the faint scrape of a chair, then David's voice, crisp and bored. So we're agreed, he said. First, we weaken them. It has to look like a decline. No drama. Sarah's answer was lighter, almost amused. I'll handle the dosing, she said. Mum will be easy. She trusts anything in a bottle. Dad might be trickier. I felt my skin crawl. It was like listening to strangers who'd stolen my children's voices. They talked about us, about me, about James, using words like assets and liabilities, like we were a house to offload or some bad stock to cut. They discussed dosages, the time frame, contingencies, phase 2 if phase 1 fails. David said, "We can't risk probate dragging if there are questions. Sarah, you're sure you can make it look like a stroke if we have to hurry it along?" "Honestly, David," she replied, with a little laugh, "I've already practiced on 7 patients. Natural causes every time." I stopped the recording. My fingers were so cold I could barely feel the buttons. Have you ever sat opposite a stranger and realized they know more about your life than you do? That's what it felt like with Robert, watching me as if I might break. "Are you all right, Mrs. Henderson?" he asked. "No," I said, because I couldn't pretend. "But I'm listening." I played more. They moved on to money, the house, James's life insurance, my small teacher's pension, even the bloody car. David had already forged my signature on something. Sarah was timing my sedatives around GP appointments so that if I became confused, there'd be a neat little explanation in my notes. My whole existence had been color-coded and scheduled in their plan, down to my death certificate. By the time I stopped, my heartbeat was hammering so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I folded the note back along its neat creases and slipped it into my handbag with the recorder. "I need to go home," I said. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. You've done more than you know." He walked me to the door, hovering like he wanted to offer a hug but didn't quite dare. "If you need a witness for anything, I did see that note," he said. "I'm happy to speak to the police." The police? Martinez, James had said his name on the recording, as calmly as if he were recommending a film. Back in my kitchen, the house felt different, less like a tomb and more like enemy territory. I spread everything out on the table: the note, the recorder, my mobile, a pad where I started scribbling my own list. Call Martinez, hide evidence, check pills. The sedatives were still in the bathroom bin, wrapped in tissue. I unfolded it, stared at the little white discs. If I tilted them under the light, I could see a manufacturer's stamp I didn't recognize. I thought of Sarah's confident hands, the way she'd watched me swallow. That was when it hit me, fully, not just as a suspicion, but as a fact. My own daughter was trying to kill me. My own son was helping her. I didn't cry. Not then. Something inside me went very still instead, like water freezing mid-flow. I rang the number James had murmured on the recording. It went to voicemail, a brisk male voice, Detective Sergeant Ray Martinez. "Leave a message." I left my name, choked out. "My husband James told me to call you. I've heard the tapes," and hung up before I could start babbling. I was still standing there, phone in hand, when I heard tires on gravel outside. Headlights swept briefly across the frosted glass of the front door, that harsh, white-blue glare of modern cars. Then I heard it, David's voice, low and controlled, right outside my home. Sarah's lighter, laughing at something, he said. They had come back at nearly midnight, and all the evidence of their little murder plan was laid out on my kitchen table like an exhibit. My first thought was simple and cold. They can't see this. Not if I want to live till morning. Tell me honestly, what would you have done with your own children on the doorstep and a bag of proof saying they were planning to bury you? I had maybe 10 seconds to erase my children's death sentence before they walked through my front door. If you were with me in part 1, you already know the situation was rotten. This is where it starts to curdle properly. And if you've just stumbled in now, you might want to stick around. This is the bit with the poison and the car chase. The headlights were still sweeping across the glass when I moved. My body went into its own strange autopilot, like the part of me that used to manage 30-year 4 seconds on a rainy Friday had taken control. I scooped everything off the kitchen table, James's note, the recorder, my own scribbles, and shoved them into a Tesco carrier bag. The chairs scraped as I pushed back. The sound horribly loud in the quiet house. Car doors slammed. Laughter, my children, sounding like they were arriving at a dinner party, not a crime scene. Our house is one of those older semis with a skinny little cellar off the kitchen. More of a glorified hole than a room. The door sticks. James always meant to plane it down. I yanked it open, heart thudding, and squeezed myself onto the top step. The air down there was cold and smelled of damp concrete, old paint and spiders. There's a heavy metal tool cabinet at the bottom, mottled with rust, full of useless screws and half-dead torches. I half ran, half slid down the steps, shoved the bag behind it, and dragged the cabinet back with both hands until it squealed against the floor. Dust billowed up, catching in my throat. The front door key turned in the lock just as I reached the top step again. I shut the cellar door, pressed my palm flat against the wood for a second to make sure it caught, then walked back into the kitchen as calmly as I could manage. My pulse was banging so hard in my ears I almost didn't hear them. Mum, David called. "You still up?" I pasted on what I hoped was a dazed, grief-stricken expression and stepped into the hall. "Oh, it's you." They were framed in the doorway like a portrait David in his immaculate overcoat, tie loosened just enough to look human. Sarah with her hair scraped back, still in her nurse's fleece, a supermarket bag hanging from one hand. "We were worried," Sarah said, her voice soft. "You didn't answer your mobile." I lied without thinking. Battery died. I was just sitting. They came in, closing the door behind them with the easy entitlement of people who believed they owned everything inside. Sarah brushed past me into the kitchen, automatically putting the kettle on, because that's what caring daughters do in British dramas. They make tea and poison it. David stayed in the hall, looking at me with that solicitor's assessment face, as if I were a witness on the stand. His eyes flicked over my shoulders towards the kitchen, then back. I realized, with a sick little twist, that he was checking for signs of panic. "Evidence. Anything out of place? You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said. "We thought we'd pop over. Make sure you're coping." I could feel sweat sliding down my spine under my jumper. "I'll be all right," I said. "It's late. You both work tomorrow." He smiled, the practiced, reassuring version he used for nervous clients. "We can grab a few hours kip on the sofa if we have to. It's not a problem." In the kitchen, mugs clinked. I heard the cupboard where we kept the paracetamol click open, then shut. My mouth went dry. Have you ever stood there listening to someone move around your own kitchen and realized every sound might be part of a plan to kill you? It turns the simplest things, the rattle of cups, the hiss of the kettle, into background music for a horror film. They stayed about 40 minutes that night, long enough for Sarah to hand me more sedatives and watch me pretend to swallow again. Long enough for David to mention, very gently, that we should talk about your future. Mum, wills, powers of attorney, making sure you're secure. I agreed to everything. In theory, I nodded, squeezed their hands. Let Sarah tuck a blanket round my shoulders on the sofa. I played the part of the grateful, exhausted widow so well I almost convinced myself. At the door, as they finally left, Sarah leaned in and kissed my cheek. Her lips were cold. "Try to sleep," she murmured, "and don't forget your pills." When the door clicked shut behind them, I stood there in the dark hall and let the blanket fall to the floor. My hands were trembling so violently I had to press them against the wall. If any of this sounds uncomfortably familiar, being managed, medicated, gently pushed, you can tell me later. You're not the only one. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table till the sky shifted from black to that thin, gray, pre-dawn. The note and recorder were still hidden downstairs. I left them there. At 7:30, my mobile rang with an unknown number. Mrs. Henderson. The voice was clipped. Midland's accent. Professional. This is Detective Sergeant Ray Martinez. I missed a call from you last night. I told him, in as few words as possible, about James's note, the recording. What I'd heard. There was a silence on the other end of the line that felt like a held breath. All right, he said finally. James came to us 3 months ago with concerns. Financial anomalies. Suspicious deaths linked to your daughter's ward. I need to see you. In person, today. My stomach lurched. They're watching me, I said. They came round last night. Can you get out of the house alone? He asked. We'll meet somewhere public. Busy. Do you drive? I looked at the keys hanging on the hook by the back door. Yes. Good. There's a service station off the A34. About 20 minutes from you. Little chef's gone. But there's still a diner there. Ugly blue sign. You can't miss it. Can you be there for 10? I glanced at the clock. Just after 8. Yes. Tell them you have an insurance appointment, he said, not missing a beat. With the man from the life policy, it's plausible and they'll be too interested in the money to argue. And Mrs. Henderson. Don't drink anything they give you. Not water. Not tea. Nothing. We rang off. I grabbed my handbag, shoved my purse and phone in, and slipped down to the cellar one last time. The air felt colder now. Knowing what was hidden down there with the paint tins and spiders, my husband's ghost, neatly documented. I left the bag behind the cabinet, exactly where I'd shoved it. If Martinez was real, if he came through, he could collect it. If he wasn't, well, then nothing would matter much anyway. I'd just come back up and put my coat on when there was a knock at the front door. Not the tentative tap of a visitor, but 3 brisk raps. Authoritative. I froze, then forced myself to move. They already had keys. Knocking was theater. I opened the door a crack. David stood there, immaculate again. Tie straight now. Sarah was beside him, holding a takeaway coffee tray. We thought we'd bring you breakfast, she said brightly. You shouldn't be driving on an empty stomach. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I was just on my way out. I said, insurance chap. He could only do this morning. David's eyes narrowed. Insurance? James's life policy. I said, he wanted me to sort it quickly. You know what he was like. It was close enough to truth to feel solid on my tongue. James had always nagged about paperwork. Sarah stepped forward, smile not shifting. All the more reason to have a coffee first. She said, you look wiped out. Mum, it's not safe. She lifted one of the cardboard cups towards me. The steam curled up, carrying the smell of strong, dark roast. And under it, something faintly metallic and wrong. As she moved, I saw it a tiny glass vial between her fingers, half hidden by the sleeve of her fleece, the way a magician palms a coin. My heart gave one hard thud. I'll drink mine in the car, I said lightly, taking the cup but keeping my fingers on the lid. Honestly, if I don't leave now, I'll miss him, and you know what these people are like. David shifted subtly, positioning himself just inside the doorway, blocking most of the hall. We can come with you, he said. Make sure they don't fob you off. I had a sudden, vivid image of walking into some anonymous office building between my 2 children and simply never walking out again. No, I said, sharper than I meant to. I softened it with a wobble. I mean, I need to do at least one thing on my own. Don't I for Dad? There was a beat where I thought he might push it. His jaw tightened. Then he stepped back, performing a little gentlemanly half-bow. All right, he said. Text us when you're done. We'll sort dinner later. I nodded, turned away, and walked. very carefully, to the kitchen. I could feel their eyes on my back. My hands shook just enough that the coffee slopped dangerously close to my fingers. At the sink, with my body between them and the worktop, I popped the lid off and tipped the entire contents straight down the drain. The smell rose up hot and bitter, making my eyes water. A brown stain streaked the enamel. I turned the tap on, rinsed the cup out, then filled it half with water so it looked used. When I came back down the hall, both of them were pretending to look at the family photos on the wall. "See," I said, lifting the cup in a little salute. "Happy now?" Sarah's gaze flicked to the inside of the cup. "Checking," she smiled. "Satisfied." "Good girl," she said. That was the moment my grief finally curdled into something else. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Contempt. Maybe. Have you ever been spoken to like that? By your own child, like you're the dog that finally did the trick. I walked past them, out into the gray morning. The air was damp and crisp, the sort of chill that creeps into your bones. My little hatchback looked pitifully small next to David's gleaming BMW. As I reversed off the drive, Sarah stood in the front garden waving, the nurse, the devoted daughter. David had his phone in his hand, thumb moving briskly. He was either emailing a client or moving money that wasn't his, or maybe texting someone to say the plan was back on. The roads were busy enough that I felt anonymous once I hit the main route. I drove like I was 80. Both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, heart thudding every time a dark car loomed in the rear-view mirror. The service station appeared like something out of a bleak British film, gray concrete, bright signage, a sad little patch of scrubby grass with a picnic bench sinking into the mud. The diner had plastic-looking blue chairs and big windows steamed up from the fryers. Martinez was waiting in a corner booth, facing the door. He was in plain clothes, dark jumper, jeans, but he had the posture of a man who could stand up and turn a room inside out if he needed to. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, standing as I approached. "Eleanor, I'm sorry for your loss." It was the first time anyone had said it without tilt-your-head pity. I sat opposite him and realized my hands were still shaking. He didn't waste time. He laid it out, James coming to him with spreadsheets and bank statements highlighting unexplained cash, laundering patterns. Sarah's patients, the ones who had gone suddenly, all conveniently leaving modest estates that disappeared in fees and arrangements. "Your husband was meticulous." Martinez said he knew something was very wrong. He just couldn't accept. At first, that it was his own kids. I stared at the Formica table, tracing a groove with my nail, and now, he said, "we're looking at your son as a conduit for some very unpleasant people, cartel-linked money, identity theft. Your daughter as an angel of death who's been practicing on pensioners." My phone buzzed then, making me jump. A WhatsApp message from Sarah flashed up on the screen. "Is greater than you forgot your medication this morning. Don't be silly. Mom, you know you need it. XX." I turned the phone so he could see. He nodded, unsurprised. "She's tracking your behavior already," he said. "If anything happens, they'll say you were confused, unstable. Grief can be very useful for that sort of narrative." A second later, my phone rang. "David." "Answer," Martinez said quietly. "Speaker, put it face down." I did as he said. "Mum." David's voice filled the little booth, warm with fake concern. "How's it going with the insurance man?" I lied. Again. I talked about forms, about waiting rooms, about how he seems nice. Every word felt like walking a tightrope over something bottomless. There was a faint pause. In the background, I could hear traffic, the ticking indicator of a car. "Funny," David said at last, "because I've just driven past your house and your car's not there, and the insurance office doesn't open till 11. My stomach dropped. He'd checked. Oh, I got the time wrong, I said quickly. He rang, said he could see me early if I came to him instead. Out of town. Where David asked, and in that single word, the veneer slipped. There was no sun in it, no affection, just calculation. Martinez made a cutting motion with his hand. I swallowed. I can't talk now. I said, he's calling me in. I hung up, my fingers shaking on the screen. For a second, I thought I might be sick. He's not stupid. Martinez said, arrogant, yes, but not stupid. We need to move. Now. We left my little car in the car park and got into his, an unremarkable silver Vauxhall that looked like 100 others on the road. As we pulled out of the service station, I glanced back. A black BMW had just come in off the slip road, indicator clicking. It slowed as it passed the diner. Windows dark. He's here, I said, seatbelt on. Martinez replied, and whatever happens, don't scream. It makes people crash. We hit the dual carriageway. The BMW merged in behind us. 2, 3 cars back, then edged closer. I could see David's face in the mirror now. Calm, focused, like he was on his way to a meeting. Martinez drove like a man who'd done this before. He didn't floor it. He just began to weave through the traffic, changing lanes with a smooth, assertive rhythm that made other drivers get out of the way without quite knowing why. The BMW followed, matching us move for move. Can the police not just swoop in? I asked, voice thin. We're not in a film, he said, and he hasn't technically done anything yet. Stay with me. The next 10, 15 minutes blurred into a series of images, brake lights flaring red, a lorry horn blaring as we cut in front, the sickening sway as we took a roundabout too fast, tires squealing. At one point, David pulled alongside us, window down, his mouth moving. I didn't need to hear the words to know they weren't kind. Then, suddenly, Martinez swung off onto a narrow B road, hedges pressing in on either side. The BMW overshot the turning, trapped in the outside lane by a caravan and an HGV. By the time he could double back, we were gone, swallowed by the back roads. We drove in silence for a while, both of us breathing hard. Eventually, he pulled into a lay-by, overlooking a field of winter-stubbled earth, and killed the engine. He won't give up now, Martinez said. He knows you're with me. He knows James talked. We need to get you somewhere they don't control. My sister, I said automatically. Ruth, she's in Reading? He nodded. Good. We'll head there next. I'll get local units to collect the evidence from your cellar, and we'll put a protection detail on the house. He started the engine again, then glanced at me. Eleanor, you understand, don't you? From this point on, there's no going back to normal. I looked out at the bleak field, the gray sky hanging low, somewhere out there, on some other road. My son was turning his expensive car around, recalculating his route to my death. Normal died with James, I said. Now we're just seeing who's still standing at the funeral. If you're still here with me, listening, keep hold of your seatbelt. Because while we headed towards my sister's for safety, David and Sarah were already planning how to turn it into a war zone. Normal died with James. Reading just buried the last illusion with it. If you've stayed with me this far, you already know we weren't heading for a cozy family reunion. We were driving straight into the next circle of hell. And if you're listening in your own quiet house right now, you might want to check your locks before we get to the end of this part. The drive to Ruth's took just over an hour, but it felt like we were moving through treacle. Every time I saw a dark saloon in the mirror, my muscles locked. Martinez kept one eye on the road and the other on the world around us, scanning laybys and junctions like the killer might simply step out of the hedgerow. You don't have to tell your sister everything, he said at one point, just enough so she doesn't open the door to anyone who smiles. He didn't get it. Ruth and I had grown up sharing a bedroom and tights. We'd swapped secrets over shared chips behind the bus stop. How do you half tell your sister your children are trying to murder you? Ruth's house was one of those red brick terraces near the university. Narrow hallway. Steep stairs. The smell of fabric softener and cat food. Her tiny front garden had plastic windmills stuck in the soil, turning lazily in the wind. It looked like the kind of place where terrible things only ever happen to other people on the news. She opened the door before we knocked, as if she'd been pacing behind it. Her hair was still in the messy bun she wore for night shifts, tracksuit bottoms tucked into socks. "Nell," she said, eyes flicking from my face to Martinez's ID badge. "What on earth?" "Inside," Martinez said gently, but with that voice that doesn't invite discussion. "We'll talk inside." We sat at her little pine kitchen table, the three of us, while the kettle boiled and one of her cats wound itself relentlessly around my ankles. I gave her the abridged version, James's note. The recording. The poisoning. I didn't say the words serial killer or cartel, but they hung in the space between us anyway. At first, she laughed. A short, incredulous sound. "David and Sarah, don't be daft. David sends Christmas cards to his clients' dogs. Sarah looks after dying old ladies for a living. She's always been the soft one." Martinez slid his notebook towards her, open at a list of dates and names. "These are the patients who died on your niece's wards over the last 3 years," he said. "These are the bank transfers linked to your nephew's shell companies." Her fingers fluttered over the page but didn't quite land. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," he interrupted, softly, "that James was right to be worried. And Eleanor is right to be afraid." Ruth looked at me then, properly, seeing the tremor in my hands, the gray under my eyes. Something in her posture shifted. She reached across and grabbed my wrist, like she used to when we crossed roads as children. "Well then," she said, "you're not going anywhere. You're staying here, and we'll let the police sort this mess." You know, that moment when someone says something sensible and you realize you've been holding your breath for hours, that's what it felt like, for a heartbeat. I let myself believe in safety. Martinez stepped into the hallway to make a call, voice low and clipped, requesting a team to my house to recover priority evidence from the cellar, authorizing an exhumation order, arranging for a local doctor to see me. Hearing him say those words, exhumation, poisoning, made it all feel horribly official. The way it becomes real when you see your name on a hospital wristband. While we waited for whatever came next, Ruth made tea like it was a spell to ward off evil. She fussed with biscuits, moved a basket of laundry for the 3rd time. Her hands needed something to do, so they did the things they always had. "Do you feel ill?" she asked suddenly, turning to me. "Properly ill. I mean, not just grief." I thought about it. The headaches I'd blamed on crying, the bone-deep tiredness I'd put down to getting older, the occasional flutter in my chest when I climbed the stairs. I thought it was the menopause's last revenge. I said, maybe it wasn't. If you've ever second-guessed your own body like that, wondering if you missed something obvious, you're not alone. You could fill a city with women who were told they were just tired when they were actually dying. The doctor arrived that afternoon. Not a kindly GP from down the road, but a brisk woman in a navy blazer with a lanyard that said something unhelpfully vague about forensic services. She took blood, made notes, asked if I had any of the pills left. In the bathroom bin, wrapped in tissue. I said, "From yesterday, and some in the cabinet." She nodded. "Businesslike. They'll be collected with the rest of the evidence. We'll prioritize your results." "That's what you say to everyone, isn't it?" I muttered. She surprised me by meeting my eyes. "No," she said. Usually we say, "You're fine," and send people home with paracetamol. She left with a cool nod, her samples in a hard plastic box. Martinez trailed after her, barking instructions into his phone. Words like post-mortem and potassium levels and fast-track the talk screen floating back down the hall. Evening crept in slowly. Ruth insisted on cooking pasta bake, garlic bread, something hot and stodgy and normal. It felt like chewing cardboard. My phone sat on the table between us, a small black bomb waiting to go off. It didn't take long. The first call came just after 9. Sarah. Her contact photo, the one with the silly Christmas hat, flashed up on the screen, mocking me. Put it on speaker. Martinez murmured from the doorway, "And don't give her more than you have to." I hesitated for half a ring, then answered, "Hello." "Mum." Her voice oozed concern. "You didn't text. David said you sounded odd earlier. Where are you?" "At Ruth's," I said, because there was no point lying about that. I needed some time away from the house. Without telling us, her tone sharpened just a fraction. "You know you're not yourself at the moment. Anything could happen." Behind her words, I could hear hospital sounds, a trolley squeaking, a distant cough. For a second, I pictured her walking a ward, selecting her next practice patient the way other people pick out birthday cards. "I'm perfectly capable of going to see my sister," I said. "I'm 64. Not 6. She sighed. "You forgot your medication this morning. And you hung up on David. This isn't like you." "I'm worried you're deteriorating." There it was. The word they'd use in reports. Deteriorating. I felt something inside me curl into a fist. "You mean I'm not doing as I'm told?" I said. "That's not the same thing." Her voice dropped, lost its sugary edge. "Listen to me very carefully." "Mum," she said, "if you keep behaving like this, running off, making wild accusations, refusing your prescribed meds, people are going to think you're not in your right mind. And if that happens, you know what the court does with old ladies' assets." She didn't have to spell it out. "They'd have me assessed. They'd paint me as confused, paranoid. They'd take control of everything James had left me and call it safeguarding." "Is that a threat?" I asked, my hand tightening around the phone. "It's a concern," she replied, "for your own good." Martinez mouthed, "Asterisk. Keep her talking, asterisk." I swallowed. "What did you put in the pills?" "Sarah," I asked, very softly. "The ones you've been feeding me for months." There was a tiny pause. "The kind you'd miss if you weren't listening for it. Sedatives," she said, "to help you cope. You told Dad the same thing, didn't you?" I pushed. Before his heart attack, silence crackled down the line. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, lower, almost bored. The nurse mask had slipped. "Dad was stubborn," she said. "He made everything harder than it had to be. You're not like him. You know when to lie down and take your medicine." Have you ever heard someone you love admit something without really saying the words, and you realize they're proud of it? It's a special kind of chill. "If anything happens to me," I said, "there's a detective sergeant who'll be very interested in our little chat." She laughed then. A short, delighted sound. "Oh, Mom, you really shouldn't have gone poking around in Dad's paperwork." She hung up before I could answer. I stared at the dead screen, my own reflection pale and distorted in the black glass. Ruth's hand found my shoulder, fingers digging in. "She didn't," Ruth whispered. "Tell me she didn't." "She did," I said. "To both of us. If you're wondering why I didn't break down then," sobbed my heart out onto Ruth's laminate floor. "I don't know. Maybe there's a point where the well just runs dry. Or maybe my body knew I'd need the tears later." The second call came half an hour later. David this time. No preamble, no fake warmth. "Put me on speaker," he said as soon as I answered. "And don't bother lying. I know exactly where you are." I did as he asked. Martinez was already recording, phone held casually at chest height. "Do you now?" I said. "I suppose tracking me is part of your client care package." "I've had eyes on Ruth's street since you pulled in," he said. "Matter of fact, you walk straight under the camera at the end of the road. You really ought to pay more attention to your surroundings." I felt Ruth stiffen beside me. Her neat little house, with its plastic windmills and cat hair on the cushions, suddenly felt like a stage, lit up for an audience we couldn't see. "What do you want?" "David," I asked. "To stop you making a mess," he said. "You're talking to people you shouldn't, about things you don't understand. That ends tonight." There was a faint ticking sound, like a fingernail tapping plastic. I realized he was playing with something, a pen cap, a lighter, or something worse. "I'm parked outside," he went on. "In the BMW, if you look out the front bedroom window, you'll see me." Martinez shook his head sharply, mouthing, "Asterisk, don't asterisk." My legs didn't need telling. They'd gone to jelly. "And if I don't come out?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "It's not just your sister who loves her little terraced street," he said. "Shame if anything happened to it. Gas leaks can be unpredictable, can't they? Car explosions, that sort of thing." He let the words hang there, oily and thick. Ruth clamped a hand over her mouth. The cat shot out of the room, fur on end. "What have you got in that car?" David Martinez murmured under his breath, more to himself than to me. David chuckled down the line, as if he'd heard. "Let's call it phase 2, he said. "Insurance. You've always told us to be prepared." "Mum," he dropped his voice, suddenly intimate. "Here's what happens next. You come out alone. No, sister. No police. You get in the car. We go for a little drive and talk about how to put this whole nasty misunderstanding to bed. If you do that, everyone else sleeps safe. If you don't," the ticking sound stopped. My imagination happily supplied the rest. "Your move," he finished. He hung up. For a long, thin moment, the house was utterly silent. Even the fridge seemed to have stopped humming. "Right," Martinez said eventually, already reaching for his radio. His voice was calm, but his jaw was set like concrete. "Nobody goes anywhere near the windows. We kill the lights. We get armed response in position. And we treat that car as live." He looked at me, properly, in a way he hadn't before. Not as a witness or a widow, but as bait. "Eleanor," he said, "your son's sitting outside with what he believes is a working bomb. He thinks he can blow you, your sister, and half this street to pieces and walk away from the ashes. We're going to prove him wrong." I glanced towards the stairs, towards the small front bedroom where Ruth kept the ironing board and spare duvet. Behind those net curtains, somewhere in the dark, my son was waiting with his thumb on a detonator. If you're listening to this in the comfort of your own living room, imagine knowing that your child is parked outside, deciding whether tonight is the night he turns you into smoke. Because that's where we were when the lights went out and the real siege began. The house went black with a sound like a snapped wire. And somewhere outside, my son sat in a car he believed was packed with explosives. If you're still here with me from part 1, you already know the lights going out wasn't some romantic power cut. It was the starting pistol. And if you're listening alone right now, maybe just glance at your own windows before we go into the dark together. For a second after the power went, nobody breathed. The fridge cut off mid-hum. The boiler went quiet. Even Ruth's ancient clock seemed to choke on itself. We were left with the faint orange smear of streetlight leaking through the front curtains and the fast, panicky thump of 3 sets of hearts. "Stay down," Martinez said sharply. His voice sounded different in the dark, flatter, more dangerous. "Away from windows. He's killed the Maines, not me." So it was David. Of course it was David. Flick of a fuse, snip of a cable, the sort of neat, decisive act he took such pride in. No half measures, no warning. Martinez moved fast, a shadow against shadows, barking into his radio in short bursts. Suspect vehicle confirmed outside front, possible IED. Power out at source. Armed response to stack on rear and side. Inner cordon now. Ruth slid off her chair onto the kitchen tiles, pulling me down with her. Her hand found mine under the table. Her palm was slick with sweat. "Is this really happening?" she whispered. I squeezed her fingers hard enough to hurt. "I'm afraid so." Have you had that moment yet, where your life stops feeling like your life and starts feeling like a news story times? Neighbors described her as quiet asterisk. That's what it felt like. Crouched on the floor while my world turned into a police operation. There was a shuffle at the back door. 2 dark shapes slipped in. Armed officers. All body armor and clipped whispers, smelling faintly of rain and gun oil. One of them pressed a cold, gloved hand briefly to my shoulder in passing. It was oddly comforting, like being blessed. "Basement's clear," someone said in the hall. "We've got sight lines on the front from the stairwell and the back bedroom. No movement from the BMW." For a thrilling, foolish moment, I thought David might just sit there all night, sulking in his expensive car until he ran out of nerve or petrol. Then Martinez's radio crackled again. "Intel update," came a tinny voice. "ANPR put Sister, Sarah Henderson, leaving hospital 20 minutes ago. Mobile goes dark 2 streets away, likely on foot." I felt the hairs lift along my arms. David outside with a bomb. Sarah somewhere in the dark, on foot. "This is the bit where the horror film splits the screen," I murmured. Martinez crouched beside us, his eyes catching the faint light, sharp and intent. "She'll try the back," he said. "She knows you. She knows you'll run away from the front." He wasn't wrong. If you'd asked me to write my own death, I'd have put it in the kitchen or the back garden. Familiar territory. That's where you'd lure an animal that thinks it's safe. "Ruth," he said quietly, "go with PC Daniels here. Back bedroom. Stay low. Eleanor," he looked at me for a beat. "You stay with me." I understood, unpleasantly quickly. Ruth was a civilian. I was bait. "Do I get a say?" I asked, trying for wry. "Not tonight," he said, "but you get to talk. That's your weapon." We moved up the stairs like ghosts, the officers ahead of us, their guns glinting with tiny, eerie dots from their sights. The house felt smaller without lights, the wallpaper closing in. Every creak amplified. They settled me in the doorway between the small box room and the landing, a crossroads of sorts. If someone came up from the back door, they'd have to pass this way. Martinez had positioned himself in the gloom of the stairwell, just out of sight. I could feel his presence more than see him. "Remember," he murmured, "keep her talking. The more she boasts, the more we can bury her with it." "This is my daughter," I whispered back. "Yes," he said. "And she's killed people." Those 2 things can be true at the same time. Downstairs, something clinked faintly. Metal on glass, maybe. A back window catch. A kitchen handle. My body flooded with cold. If you're squeamish, I'll warn you now. This is the bit you might want to brace yourself for. The first sign was smell. A waft of cold air carrying in the outside night. Damp earth. Someone's distant wood smoke. Then the almost imperceptible scuff of a shoe against linoleum. She moved well. I'll give her that. Years of night shifts on wards, slipping in and out of rooms where people slept or pretended to. She came up the stairs like a rumor, not a person. Come on. Mum, her voice floated up out of the dark below, almost sing-song. Don't make this difficult. It was the intimacy of it that made my skin crawl. Any other words, any other tone. And I might have believed this was just some horrible prank. I'm here, I called back, surprised at how steady I sounded. You always did hate shouting up the stairs. There was a pause. I pictured her on the bottom step, head tilted, assessing. She'd be carrying a bag, nurses always do, and inside, not sandwiches and pens, but whatever blend she favored for quick, undetectable death. You came to me on the ward once, I said into the darkness. Do you remember? When I had that virus and they kept me in overnight, you said you loved it there. All that power and no one questioning you. The stair treads creaked. One by one, her silhouette appeared, darker than the dark. You shouldn't have listened to Dad's tapes, she said, conversationally. You were meant to drift away, peacefully, no drama. This is very inefficient. A small, absurd part of me wanted to apologize for inconveniencing her murder schedule. How many patients? Sarah, I asked. Before Dad. Before me, a soft exhale, almost a laugh. You always do this, she said. Numbers, numbers, numbers. Fine. 7 that you'd trace easily. More. If you knew where to look. They begged for it. Some of them. You should be thanking me. She was close enough now that I could make out the pale oval of her face, the slick shine of her hair pulled tight. In her hand, something glinted briefly as it caught the spill of streetlight. A syringe. Of course, behind her, lower down. I sensed the officers shifting, raising their weapons. Martinez's voice, when it came, was low and careful. Armed police. Sarah, don't move. She didn't even flinch. Her eyes stayed on me, bright and intent. Do you know what I call you in my head? She asked. My masterpiece. Practice is one thing, but there's nothing like finally applying your skills to the person who made you. It should have broken me. That line. Instead, something in me. That old teacher. That tired mother. That woman James had loved came awake and sharp. I'm impressed, I said. Most people your age only manage a yoga qualification or an affair. You went straight for paticide and maticide. Very efficient. She smiled. For a second, I saw my little girl in that expression, the one who'd been so pleased with a gold star that she'd stuck it to her forehead. You're stalling, she said. Yes, I agreed, but so are you. It was the only warning I got. 1 minute, she was 3 steps below me. The next, she'd surged up, hand flashing forward, the syringe needle, a thin, silver line aimed at my throat. There was a deafening crack, then another, filling the narrow stairwell with light and noise. The world shrank to the smell of cordite and the sound of my own strangled gasp. Sarah screamed. The syringe flew from her fingers, hitting the wall and spinning away into the dark. She collapsed sideways onto the landing, one hand clutching her shoulder, blood seeping hot and dark between her fingers. Don't move, someone shouted. Armed police, do not move. I scrambled back against the doorframe, my legs pudding soft. Sarah writhed, swearing with a fluency I didn't know she had. You shot me, she hissed. You idiots. You actually shot me. An officer kicked the syringe out of reach. Another pinned her wrist and snapped cold metal round it. Martinez was suddenly there at my side. One hand on my arm, solid and real. You all right? He asked, close to my ear. I wanted to laugh. My daughter just tried to stab me with poison in my sister's hallway, I said. Define all right. If any of you have ever had to stand there while your own child is cuffed and read their rights, You know there isn't a word big enough for how wrong it feels. They dragged her to her feet, securing her arm in a makeshift sling while an officer held pressure on the wound. Sarah's face was pale but furious, eyes black as holes. "This is entrapment," she spat. "You can't use any of this." Mum's confused, grief-stricken. She's not a reliable witness. Martinez held up his phone, the little red recording light still glowing. "Fortunately," he said mildly, "the tape won't be grieving." They hustled her downstairs, her trainers leaving little smears of blood on Ruth's carpet. From outside came the rising wail of more sirens, the metallic clatter of vehicles being moved into position. And then, as if the night had decided it was tired of subtleties, everything happened at once. A shout from the front, "He's moving." Engine on. We all jolted. "David." I stumbled to the front bedroom, ignoring Martinez's barked protest, and peered between the edge of the curtain and the wall. The BMW sat under the orange street lamp, black paint gleaming. In the driver's seat, David was a dark shape, one hand on the wheel, the other holding something small and boxy. A remote. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. For a second, he looked almost like a little boy sitting in a go-kart, waiting for someone to tell him when to start. Then he pressed the button. I braced, every muscle in my body tightening for impact. In my mind's eye, I saw it, the white flash, the roar, Ruth's house peeling open like a tin can. Nothing happened. No explosion, no shudder. Just the faint sound of a distant fox barking and David's own scream of frustration as he stabbed the button again, and again, and again. "Come on," he shouted inside the car, slamming his fist against the dashboard. "Come on, you useless." Armed officers swarmed him like floodwater. Doors wrenched open, hands grabbing, voices overlapping. "Show me your hands. Get out of the vehicle. Drop it now." The remote skittered out of his grasp, landing harmlessly on the tarmac. Martina's radio crackled again. "Device is cold," came a voice. "Confirm EOD stripped it 6 hours ago from lockup, per prior intel. This is a dummy detonator. Repeat, bomb already rendered safe." 6 hours ago, I stared down at my son, pinned face first over the bonnet of his precious car, arms wrenched behind his back. He looked utterly lost. Martinez came to stand beside me at the window. "Your husband told us about Phase 2 3 months ago," he said quietly. "Blueprints, materials, the whole lot." We picked up the device from a lockup he'd identified, left a shell in its place, just in case. "So James knew," I said. My mouth felt dry. He knew they'd try this. He hoped they wouldn't. Martinez replied, "But he didn't bet your life on that hope." Outside, they hauled David upright. His face was wet, with rain, tears, sweat. I couldn't tell. He twisted his head towards the house, eyes searching the upstairs windows until they found mine. "Mum," he shouted, "they're lying. It was never meant to go off. It was just leverage. I wouldn't have." The officer at his elbow jerked his arm, cutting him off. He stumbled, wincing. "David Henderson." Someone intoned, all formal now. "You are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to murder, attempted murder, and offenses under the Terrorism Act. You do not have to say anything." His gaze stayed locked on mine as they read him his rights. For a second, I saw the boy who'd once cried when his goldfish died, who'd held my hand on the way to school. Then that image flickered and died, replaced by the man who had just tried to blow up a street because his parents were worth more dead than alive. The front door opened behind me. An officer stepped in, head set askew, phone in hand. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "it's the lab. For you, because of course, on top of everything else, This was the perfect moment to find out exactly how poisoned I was. I took the phone with fingers that no longer quite felt like mine. Eleanor speaking. A clinical, disembodied voice relayed numbers and levels I didn't understand, followed by the translated version, yes. I had been ingesting something toxic for months. No, I wasn't going to drop dead that night. Yes, there might be lasting damage. No, nobody could fully predict what. When I hung up, the house seemed to tilt very slightly, as if settling into a new shape. Good news, Martinez asked. I'm not dying today, I said. Apparently that's the bar now. He gave a small huff that might have been a laugh. I'll take it. Through the open door, I watched my children being loaded into separate vehicles, Sarah strapped down and sedated. David still fighting the hand on his head as they eased him in. Blue lights washed the street in pulses of color. Neighbors' curtains twitching like nervous eyelids. Have you ever stood on a doorstep in your slippers and watched your family driven away in police vans? I don't recommend it. It's one of those experiences you only need the once. As the cars pulled off, taking my monsters to their cages, I realized something unexpected. The fear that had been coiled in my gut for days had loosened its grip. What was left wasn't peace. Exactly. More like a raw, echoing emptiness, waiting to be filled with whatever came next. Statements, trials, headlines, healing. Martinez touched my elbow gently. This is just the end of the first act, he said. They'll try to spin, to bargain, to blame you. Even now. Are you ready for that? I looked at the dark patch on the carpet where Sarah's blood was drying, at the dent in the curtain where I'd held it back to watch David fail to blow us up. Oh, Detective, I said, my voice rough but steady. After tonight, I'm ready for anything. Because if you think this story ends with sirens fading into the distance, you're wrong. The real reckoning was still to come. In a courtroom where James would speak from the grave one last time, and I would have to sit opposite my children and listen to the total of their sins. I told Martinez I was ready for anything, but nothing prepares you for sitting opposite your own children in the dock. If you've walked with me from part one, you've heard the whispers, the recordings, the sirens. This is where it all gets dragged into fluorescent light and legal language. And if you're listening with a cup of tea in your hand, just know this court is nothing like the dramas. It's slower, colder, and far more surgical. 6 months later, the world had turned, but my life was still pinned to that night in Ruth's house. James's body had been exhumed and examined. My blood had been spun and tested. The cellar had been emptied of evidence. The little plastic recorder was now Crown property. I'd given so many statements I could recite them in my sleep. On the morning of the trial, I stood outside the Crown Court in my best black coat, watching barristers in wigs drift past like oddly plumed birds. The building itself was all glass and pale stone, very modern, very clean. It smelled of polish and old fear. CPS will go hard, Martinez had told me. Multiple murders, organized crime, terrorism offenses. They want the book thrown and then the bookcase. Inside, the courtroom was cooler than I expected. High ceiling, pale wood, a sense of ordered brutality. Everything had its place: the judge's bench, the jury box, the dock, the witness stand. They brought David and Sarah in together, but kept them a good 2 feet apart in the glass-fronted dock. For a moment, we just looked at each other. David had lost weight. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a bland shirt and trousers that never quite fitted. Without his armor of tailoring and confidence, he looked younger and smaller, like the boy who'd once borrowed James's shoes for a school play and tripped over them. Sarah wore a simple blouse, hair looser than I'd ever seen it, a scar peeking pale and angry at the edge of her collar. The bullet's legacy. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were restless, scanning the room like a nurse on a busy ward, triaging threats. I sat in the public gallery between Ruth and a victim support volunteer with kind eyes and a notebook. Martinez was a few rows back, stone still. The charges were read. There were so many that they blurred at the edges: conspiracy to murder, attempted murder, administering a noxious substance, fraud, money laundering, offenses under the Terrorism Act, and then the long, numbing list of names: Sarah's patients, David's ruined clients. "Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" the clerk asked. "Not guilty," David said clearly, chin up, eyes forward. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, then echoed him. "Not guilty." If you've ever had someone lie to your face in front of a room full of people, you'll understand the particular hollow that opens in your chest. It's like being erased in real time. The prosecution's opening was clinical. The barrister, a woman with a voice like cut glass, laid it out as if she were aligning samples under a microscope: the financial trail, the pharmacy logs, the exhumation results, the bomb components, and James's investigation, the thread pulling all the pieces together. And then, she said, there is the matter of the recordings made by the deceased, Mr. James Henderson, and recovered from his person post-mortem. For a moment, everything in me seized. Hearing his name like that, the deceased, said calmly in a room where he wasn't, hurt more than any bullet ever could. They played a clip first, not the whole thing. Just enough to introduce James as a voice rather than a corpse. His calm tone filled the courtroom, bouncing off the walls. "If you're hearing this, Nell," he said, "I'm gone." And it wasn't natural. I watched the jury, 9 strangers, and 3 who looked faintly familiar in that might be from Tesco way, register the shock of a dead man speaking. Several glanced at me, perhaps imagining themselves in my place. Then came the businesslike bits: David and Sarah discussing Phase 1, Phase 2, dosages, probate timelines, my children's voices, filtered through cheap plastic and grief, turned into evidence. The defense tried to pick at it, of course. They suggested the tapes were edited, that James had become paranoid, that phrases were taken out of context. They tried to paint him as a man slipping into some late-onset suspicion, seeing patterns where there were none. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Henderson," David's barrister asked me during cross-examination, "that your husband had become increasingly fixated on the idea that your children were out to get him?" I looked at the man, perfectly polite, perfectly paid, and then at the jury. He was fixated on numbers that didn't add up. I said, on patients dying when they shouldn't, on cars bought with cash that didn't exist. If you call that paranoia, then perhaps we need more paranoid people in accountancy. A few members of the public gallery snorted. The judge frowned. I didn't care. The medical evidence was worse. Hearing a pathologist calmly explain how potassium chloride interferes with the heart's electrical system, how it can mimic a heart attack if administered correctly, made my skin crawl. In Mr. Henderson's case, the doctor said, we found repeated evidence of such interference over several months, consistent with long-term poisoning. The final event was simply the last straw. In Mrs. Henderson's blood, taken shortly after her removal from the family home, we found traces of the same substance, in lower but significant doses. The defense tried to suggest accidental contamination, mislabeled medication, anything but intent. But intent had already written itself all over those recordings. And, in Sarah's own words on my phone, they played those too. Hearing her voice, that bored, professional tone, as she talked about 7 you'd trace easily, echo round the courtroom, made one juror put her hand to her mouth. Do you still maintain, the prosecutor asked Sarah later, that you were simply doing your job? Sarah stared straight ahead. People die, she said. If you can't handle that, don't come near a hospital. Have you ever listened to your child try to rationalize mass murder as part of the job? It takes something from you you don't get back. David's web of fraud was almost a relief by comparison. It was still monstrous, the elderly couple persuaded to sign over their savings into investment vehicles. The single mom left with debts she hadn't asked for. But it was a monster with familiar lines. Numbers, false identities, shell companies. The detective from the Financial Crimes Unit walked the jury through it all as if they were on a grim guided tour. What about the bomb? The judge asked at one point, clearly struggling with the sheer breadth of the case. A bomb disposal officer took the stand then, describing the device David had commissioned and assembled. It wasn't a film bomb. No red and blue wires, but it would have done the job. Packed into the BMW's boot, wired to a detonator. It could have turned Ruth's little street into a crater. The device was removed and rendered inert approximately 6 hours before the attempted detonation, he said, acting on intelligence provided by Mr. Henderson Sr. before his death. So James had saved us twice, once by documenting everything, once by quietly handing over the bomb before it ever reached us. If you're still listening, I want you to really hear this. He did all that while still living in the same house as the people he suspected. He went to bed every night not knowing if the person trying to kill him would decide to speed things up, and he kept going anyway. The worst, for me, was James's final message. They saved it for near the end, like some kind of summing up. The prosecutor introduced it as Mr. Henderson's statement to the court, though of course he'd never seen the inside of that room. The lights dimmed slightly.